This week is the 25th anniversary of an event, the last war, which was to have terrible consequences for over 500,000 people. In November 1940, the German occupation authorities in Poland completed the building of a walled ghetto to enclose the Jews of Warsaw. At the highest level of Nazi command, a decision was taken to make a pictorial record of the gradual destruction of these 600,000 Jews. Cameramen of the German army, the SS and the Gestapo were given the job of taking photographs and cinefilms inside the ghetto during the 3 years that followed. A survivor of the ghetto, Alexander Bernfess, has spent the last 20 years collecting these photographs together, many of them from the pages of Himmler's personal album. These photographs, together with the cinefilm shot by the Germans, have now been compiled to make tonight's BBC documentary, the first complete pictorial account of what happened. It is a grim and dreadful story. We present it as a memorial to the thousands of men, women and children who died in the Warsaw Ghetto.
I had a long talk with Herr Hitler. It was a frank talk, but it was a friendly one. And I feel satisfied now that each of us fully understands what is in the mind of the other. I'm going to have another talk with Herr Hitler. Only this time, he has told me that it is his intention to come halfway to meet me. He wishes to spare an old man another such a long journey. This morning, we regard
At dawn on Friday, September 1st, 1939, the German Army and Air Force invaded Poland. In a speech to the Reichstag, Hitler said, "I've given strict orders to our airmen only to bomb military objectives. Germany does not wage war against women and children." When the news came that Poland's allies had declared war on Germany, the people of Warsaw celebrated outside the British and French embassies. But alliances were not enough. The Polish army fought fiercely and bravely against the Germans. 200,000 Polish soldiers died in the fighting. German Stukas flew low, bombing and machine gunning the people in the streets and the queues at the food shops. This was total war, intended to destroy the morale and fighting efficiency of a nation. Petrol, bombs, or bread, we bring death to the Poles. In the last days of the siege, the bombing went on day and night, the Stukas roaring overhead continuously. By the end of September 1939, Warsaw was in ruins. During the last days of the air attacks, the German bombers attacked the Jewish quarter of the city with particularly heavy bombardment. The Germans knew it was the Jewish Day of Atonement, and as the Jews flocked to the synagogues, the attacks were concentrated. As the air raids continued, the people of Warsaw retreated to new trenches and barricades in the city. Warsaw's food supplies were running out after 20 days of siege. Most of the hospitals were out of action. Ammunition was running short. One by one, the Polish anti-aircraft guns were silenced. The guns that with the fighters had destroyed some 564 German aircraft in 3 weeks. By October 2nd, the Germans were marching into Warsaw. The German High Command gathered as the Polish defenses crumbled. Polish army and commanders were forced to surrender to the overwhelming power of the German army and air force. The German looting of Warsaw began. Shops and houses were ransacked. Furs were taken in bulk. The Germans stole everything of value, particularly bracelets and jewelry. As the early months of 1940 passed, the Nazis systematically looted houses in Warsaw, accosting Jews in the streets, forcing them to load the waiting cars. The Germans had lists of prominent citizens of Warsaw, and denunciation and murder became a daily event. Warsaw, the capital of Poland, had been the commercial center of the country. Most of Poland's Jews were there, and with the completion of the occupation, they were singled out for special treatment. They were pulled out of the food queues, they were insulted, beaten up, and shot in the street. The German governor of Warsaw ordered all Polish families to move out of the Jewish area. All Jews were to be confined within the ghetto. Tens of thousands of people left their homes. The Jews made desperate attempts to resettle in the congested area of the ghetto. This movement of people happened at a time when typhoid was raging in the city. The Jews moving to the ghetto were allowed to take only light luggage and bed linen. A third of the city's population, hundreds of thousands of people were moving through the streets. In the ghetto, there was appalling chaos. Thousands of families were milling around, trying to find somewhere to stay. Throughout the early months of 1940, work was begun enclosing an area of little more than a square mile as a ghetto for the Jews. On the morning of November the 15th, 1940, the Jews found themselves completely surrounded by high walls. There was no way out anymore. The walls were 10 feet high, with a crown of barbed wire and broken glass. Enormous notices were put up: typhus area, through traffic only. There were at first 22 gates, but later the Germans reduced these to 15 and then to 10. The gates and walls were guarded by 3 police forces. They were the German police. There were the Polish Blue Police. And there were the Jewish police. The German and Polish police carried firearms. The Jewish police force was confined to the ghetto and only allowed to carry truncheons. In this way, the entrances and exits to the ghetto were controlled. If these three authorities could be bought off, a fortune could be made by smuggling food and materials. The Jewish police force, numbering some 2,000 men, behaved with particular inhumanity towards their fellow Jews. These men supervised some of the worst brutalities of the ghetto. Eventually, they were lined up by the Germans, given a brief speech of thanks for their work, and shot in the back by mounted machine guns, commanded by one of the German Death Head battalions. Many of the Germans were afraid to go into the ghetto because of the dangers of typhus and tuberculosis. Day by day, the government of the ghetto was carried out by a body of Jewish elders called the Judenrats. This committee of Jews was the executive organ of the German occupying force in the ghetto. This council was obliged to carry out all orders of the Germans, and on one occasion was asked to supply Jewish girls for a German brothel to be set up for the conquerors. Overcrowded, with nowhere to go, the Jews walked the streets, frightened to stay indoors, seeking the safety of the crowds. But the stench was dreadful, and people tried to avoid touching each other, afraid of catching typhus and lice. Sanitary conditions were getting worse. In the early days, enough water had been available for collective washing, and some measure of delousing had been possible. The Nazis kept a careful and detailed record of life in the ghetto. Meanwhile, German propaganda emphasized the pleasures of the wealthy Jews in the ghetto. Jews were pictured wining and dining. It was scenes such as this that were used to picture life in the ghetto. The German cameraman took film of the ghetto theater, which was open in the early days for concerts and plays. Jews were also photographed sunbathing in the streets to suggest that life in the ghetto was pleasant. In July 1941, the German picture magazine Berliner Illustrierte Zeitung printed 4 pages of pictures concerning the Warsaw ghetto. It showed that rich Jews in the ghetto were living well, engaging in pleasant social activities, while they allowed Jews to starve in the streets. This boy was pictured as an example of the many juvenile delinquents in the ghetto. In fact, he was one of the thousands living on starvation rations, a quarter of the amount allowed for the Germans and half the amount allowed for the Poles. From the beginning of the occupation, no schools were permitted on the pretext of preventing the spread of typhus and contagious diseases. However, sometimes schools were organized in secret. When the ghetto had first been built, a tram bearing the Jewish Star of David ran through the streets. Eventually, this was stopped, and the Jews, without petrol and electricity, used hoses to pull the trucks and trams. As well, rickshaws were constructed from bits of wood and bicycle wheels. In the heart of 20th century Europe, the rickshaw came into being, a status symbol of the ghetto. Like all the people in the ghetto, the leaders of the Jewish community had to raise their heads to the Germans, in this case, the photographer. Every Jew over the age of 12 was obliged to wear a white armband bearing the blue Star of David, and these were sold along with food and prayer shawls. The prayer shawls served both the living and the dead. It was in this shawl that every Orthodox Jew wished to be buried. Trading continued inside the ghetto. Polish newspapers, Hebrew books, onions, bread, shoes, socks, and derelict furniture were sold in the markets. Doctors, university professors, artists, and businessmen were to be found in the market trading for food. It seemed to them that this was as bad as life could get. In the market, every last remnant of clothing was sold. Shoes were cobbled with scraps of leather from old shoes. Nearly a third of the Jews in the ghetto were wearing old and torn clothing, providing little warmth against the bitter cold of Eastern Europe. The people were weak and ailing, and some were losing their reason under the persecution. But the Nazis made use of the labor force in the ghetto. Factories of all kinds were set up. In return for their meager rations, these Jews were put to work for the Reich, and for a long time were exempt from deportation. One of the strangest features of the ghetto was the post office. Until September 1941, sums of money and small parcels of food and medical supplies were sent in from a welfare organization in America. These supplies stopped abruptly when the Japanese attacked the Americans at Pearl Harbor. The Jews' rations were a tenth of the amount needed for proper nourishment, and the poor were begging from the poor. No medical supplies were allowed in the ghetto. No medicine or attention were provided for children under the age of 3 or for adults over 45. Smuggling of food was desperately organized. Poles threw parcels of food over the wall. Small children burrowed their way through to the town outside to collect vegetables and scraps. Many Germans profiteered, selling food to the Jews. Sometimes, German heavy machine guns shot down small children as they ran under the noses of the guards. By 1942, the Jews were starving in the streets, and the German cameraman faithfully recorded their agony, even returning later to photograph the same subjects. The cameraman chose his subjects deliberately and followed them inside the ghetto. This was an assignment of obvious importance, and the methodical German captured and photographed the faces of a dying race. This was by way of an anthropological record. It was shot when film was very scarce, with meticulous detail. These pictures formed a detailed record for Himmler's own photographic album. Sometimes a scrap of bread and a cigarette were thrown by the German cameraman to attract the attention of his subjects. Many of them were ex-soldiers, still wearing the rags of their uniforms. The religious Jews were always singled out for especially brutal treatment at the hands of the Germans. Frequently, they were photographed as their beards were cut off in public. If a man lost part of his hair in this way, he would wear a cloth round his head as a symbolic replacement. Jews were sometimes photographed as their beards were burned off. Others were branded on the head with the Star of David. Often, the Germans would cut off only half the beard, pulling off bits of flesh with the blunt knives. In spite of all the persecution, Jewish religious services were held in the ghetto. These pictures were taken in secret and show the celebration of the Day of Atonement inside the ghetto. These people must have been put to death after these photographs had been taken, because worship was expressly prohibited by the Germans. Throughout 1941 and 1942, thousands of Jews were rounded up for deportation. Eventually, 5,000 people a day were leaving. Volunteers were told that they would get free rations for the journey. The Germans encouraged them to believe that they were going to be resettled in other parts of the country. In fact, these people were being transported directly to the gas chambers and firing squads of Treblinka, some 60 miles from Warsaw. Treblinka had a railway station with faked signs pointing to waiting rooms